Hello there. For a while now, I have been looking into this game engine called Godot, which is a cross-platform open source engine that you can use for both 2D games, 3D games, and even various pieces of software. And I have been considering making a game in it for a little while now. However, things don't always work out like you'd hope. And this is simply my attempt at trying to document some of the stuff that went wrong, and perhaps some of the stuff that other people could run into while trying to do certain things with the engine. So, what I wanted to do was take the map of my entire country and scale it down a little bit and put it inside of the game engine, so that, for example, I could draw a bunch of roads and have a nice little truck simulator game where you get to kind of drive around and deliver packages and all of that wonderful stuff. For that, I need access to the height maps, which essentially indicate the elevation above sea level, or in my case a bit below, because I might want to model some of the undersea near the coast. Either way, there are sites online as well as datasets that you can get completely free. And so what I could do is decide to get this data in a slightly higher resolution. And what I would get is essentially an image that's stitched together from these multiple parts. Here we go. And we have the file ready to download. Now, of course, it's like 17 megabytes, which might be a bit bigger than most people are used their photos and stuff being, but we would normally chop this up into smaller chunks so that the engine doesn't need to load in a texture that's like 11,000 pixels wide. But the data is definitely there. What we can also do is apply any number of transformations and filters to the data in case we want to slightly alter it. So, for example, I have it open here, and one of the things that I could do is applying selective Gaussian blur. What this means is that I could have the land masses that are currently a little bit noisy be affected, but leave the rivers and areas of greater contrast mostly as they are. So the idea here is that the terrain would be a little bit smoother, which of course we can easily do. And we would end up with this height map in a separate file. But this file, as I said, is a little bit too big for the actual game engine. So what we could also do is go and even look at an online tool in which we can take the texture, put it in, indicate how we want to split it, for example something like this, and then get a bunch of separate images, which we can then feed into the game engine of choice. This is where Godot normally comes in. So once we have these height maps, we should be able to generate terrains. The problem is that we don't really have terrain support in the Godot engine. But luckily, because it's an open source project and is relatively easily extensible, we could have a look at some of the community-made add-ons, which is what I actually tried using, both for the Godot 3 and Godot 4 versions. And one of the really nice things about this particular project is that we have some rather nice documentation. And the idea is that if we have the data, and as long as we get some perhaps free textures for the actual terrain materials, we should be able to get everything running within Godot. And that is initially exactly what happened. I was able to get the add-on working, create the terrain, create the textures, and also make the whole height map work, for the most part. This is also where the problem started. So for example, we can fly around and everything looks decent in the editor. Now you will notice a bunch of unevenness, which I am still trying to work out. Perhaps due to the low kind of precision that we can get by importing PNG images, because it doesn't support 24-bit ones. You treat them essentially as 8-bit images, which is not great. But hey, we can just mess around with the data directly, and there was a smooth tool, so we could use this for better terrain. However, while things look reasonably normal as they are now, once we try actually playing the scene in Godot, in version 3 we get all sorts of artifacts. So for example, if I fly around, you can see that there's a bunch of flickering and these kind of black squares, which I suspect is the LOD meshes being generated and being swapped out, but there's some sort of a glitch with it. If we look at the view mode here and choose the wireframe mode, we can actually see our terrain generating level of detail meshes, so that the bits of terrain that are nearby are higher detail than the ones that are far off. This results in pretty good performance, but the problem is that there is some sort of a bug in either the renderer or this particular implementation. And I couldn't really solve this issue in Godot 3. Now I could switch to Godot 4, which is exactly what I did. They have a new Vulkan renderer, which should have both better performance, better graphics, and in my case, no visual bugs regarding these LOD chunks. So if I fly around, it's going to look fine. Now of course there's also some graphics options I could turn on to make it look even better, but for the most part the terrain itself seems to be working. We even have like blending between different like textures that we can set up based on the depth, but that's perhaps more regarding the textures. So this part seems to work. However, I tried stitching together multiple of these terrains. So if I go over to where the other terrain meets this one, so those are like two separate objects, we will notice a few things. First and foremost, these terrains don't really match together. So it's not like they're stitched properly. There are artifacts where the height data differs. However, in other places it actually matches up, which is even more weird. I could blame this on the texture splitting process, but the problem is that Godot does not have any built-in behavior to address it. So that's not a thing that the plugin provides to us. And secondly, even though the terrains have the same textures and have the same settings in regards to rendering, one of them seems to be using all of the normal maps and stuff, and the other one just doesn't, which is exceedingly weird. So let's actually go over to the editor and look at the rendering settings. So we have shader type classic 4, we have a bunch of this stuff, and if you look at the other terrain, but yeah, basically it's the same thing, the same textures, everything should work, but it does not. And this happens both in the editor and when you're actually running it. There's also another issue that I ran into with Godot in particular, where if you try to paint textures on the terrain, sometimes it kind of glitches out. So for example, see how I'm targeting the side? Well, it is painted in the middle. There's like some weird offset going on, which is quite annoying, especially if you want to do like fine adjustments. But sometimes I also ran into an issue where it just would not be painted at all, or sometimes the changes would not show up in the actual project that you have like changed, right? Which is kind of immensely weird, because that's not what you would expect from a pretty basic like terrain implementation. So for example, if we fly over in the scene that we actually run, we don't see any of that like other new color that should be here. There's nothing. There's still the kind of old green one. And this is fairly misleading if the thing that you see in the editor is completely different from what you should see in the actual game. So definitely this implementation in particular doesn't inspire all that much confidence. Now, what can we do about this? We could probably go over to this plugin, where it's developed on GitHub, and create an issue. Essentially share our project, share a quick video or a GIF of what's going wrong, a bit of a description, and what else we know about how this happens. The problem with that is that this takes a significant amount of time and effort, and sadly, if basic things like this do not work, most people won't really bother with this. Now, we could of course also dive into the code and try to add the features that are missing. And we could also try to fix any bugs that we come across. But once again, this takes a lot of effort and also the know-how of actually doing the thing you want. So this also won't happen. And this is essentially the situation for many open source projects, where the amount of maintainers you get isn't all that high. And of course, they also don't get paid for this, which only further complicates matters for everyone. But honestly, if the textures kind of break and there's no way to stitch these terrains together, and there are like really bad visual artifacts on the other version, on Godot 3, somehow I lose faith in being able to use this thing out of the box. Like, to me, this does not seem, let's say, production ready. So what other options are there? Well, the one that I opted for is to just switch game engines and go for Unity. Unity has some pretty good documentation for terrain tools. They have been around for a long time and they do most of what you might want. And of course, Unity also has a really big asset store where you will be able to find like third-party implementations in case you have issues with anything that the engine provides itself. That said, I don't really like Unity. You see, compared to Godot, installing it takes a bunch more space. It is just slower when you work on various scripts, and it just becomes a bit of a mess with both larger projects and the direction that they are taking the game engine in. For example, we have multiple render pipelines, but the materials in those sometimes need to be converted, and that is error prone. Other times we have something like DOTS, the kind of performance conscious entity component system, which also isn't entirely finished. There was also the whole situation with networking, where the official implementation was deprecated with nothing to replace it, and there were also similar situations with the kind of, I guess, UI components and input systems, and essentially the engine is being changed without really being all that stable, and it becomes a bit of a mess for larger projects. That said, what we have here is the very same terrain re-imported. So the same data that was in Godot 3 and Godot 4, except that I had to change into raw format, but I still could not get like high precision working, so it's still very pixelated. But on the bright side, it seems to be working fine. The performance is decent, with the universal render pipeline in this case. Of course, you can see a bit more LOD pop-in, but that's just the configuration that I have here. However, if we go over to the seams, so where these two terrains meet, we will see essentially the same problem as I had just now. So it seems to me that Unity has the exact same issues which Godot has. Well, at least in regards to these height maps. However, Unity has tools for actually kind of stitching these terrains together properly. So if we go over here, and there's an option called Auto Connect. So we could try to reconnect, which does not work. Like, we can change a bunch of settings, but it still does not work. So to me now, it feels that it's a problem with how these textures are sliced. At the end of the day, I am not really sure what to think. So the implementation of terrains in Unity seems a little bit more polished, but there are still issues. So if the height maps that I have are basically just two images, why couldn't the engine just alter them so that, for example, this bit matches this bit in their height and they are kind of stitched together? For whatever reason, it doesn't seem to be working correctly. But then again, I might need to mess around with, let's say, the terrain smoothing tools. So let's go over here, let's try to paint the terrain. And instead of texture, we might want to just smooth it. So let's try doing this. And the wonderful thing here is that you can actually do that across multiple terrains. So if I was to do this across the seams, now there should be no issues. So it appears that there was something with the height maps themselves going on that was a bit weird. But while I can do this in Unity and fix everything this way, as long as I don't mind, the data being slightly altered, this does not work in Godot. Because if I go over to Godot and look at this kind of changed texture that I have here, and I try to use the smoothing tool across multiple terrains. So here we go, smooth height. Let's change the brush size to something smaller, and let's try to do this across different terrains. I can only affect the one that I currently have selected. So I would have to select the other one and then also do some smoothing. But the problem with this is that this doesn't affect both of them, and there is no way for me to close this sort of jaggy point where they should meet and be the same height. So if I can't get the ideal height maps in that match correctly, Godot isn't going to work for me, whereas Unity can work with a little bit of manual work, even if the data isn't excellent. Oh, and by the way, here's another really nice feature that Unity has in regards to terrains. So if I was to delete the one that I just created, what I could do is decide that, okay, I need more chunks, so I am going to manually create a new one. And it gives me these options where I want to extend the terrain. And if I press this, I will get a new terrain automatically in the correct location. And then all that I need to do is essentially import the height map data. So once I have the correct location, I can just choose the raw data and import it. Now my problem is that I can't really save it as a 16-bit file in GIMP or other software automatically. Instead, I just get errors. So 8-bit and flipped vertically is the option that I need, which is almost kind of unfortunate. And also the stitching still has those issues until I actually try doing some smoothing in the paint option. But hey, this is still relatively easy. Especially because I have this data all kind of jagged. I could just increase the brush size to something insanely big and just press it a few times. And although that's kind of a manual thing that you are doing, I would just need to do it a few times and all of the seams of any tiles would be fixed, in addition to the actual terrain being more smooth. So for example, you could see that, oh hey, here's a river. My only problem is that the data quality itself isn't excellent. So for example, the height maps, I do think they include not only the actual ground, but also some of the treetops and other things that could mess with the data. So of course some additional processing would be needed if I wanted to kind of use this seriously. But for quick prototyping, honestly this is fine, right? You have some area that's the sea, and then you have some mountains and a bunch of other stuff. And you can iterate upon this. At the end of the day, you can still get things done with Godot, and it seems like the actual plugin is still in active development and they're porting it for Godot 4, and as you saw, it works. However, some people will just choose to go with the solution that's a little bit easier and works now, which is Unity. Or maybe some people also are okay with writing a bit of C++ and Unreal Engine will be their engine of choice. But for now, I think I will just stick with Unity and hope that Godot gets a little bit better in the meantime, or maybe even gets official terrain support in the actual engine, so that it can become a bit more battle tested by all of the lovely people who are going to use it. Until then, I hope you have a nice day.